Hi, Julie Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I've talked a lot in my perfume bottle video, my jewelry videos, both the necklaces and the tiaras, about royal icing transfers, and particularly the little gems and things that I used on top. So in this video, it's sort of video number 1 of my royal icing transfer series. I'm going to talk about very simple round and oval transfers and different types of finishes you can put on both of those. In my next video, I'll be taking transfers up a notch by doing more intricate trace patterns. So for now, we're starting with the basics. If you haven't done transfers before, this is the place to start. So just as an example, if you haven't seen those jewelry videos, these are some medallions that I strung into tiaras and necklaces, and put on tiaras in previous videos. I've got pieces in the middle that sort of simulate turquoise and little kind of gems, either pearls or other types of shiny beads that are on the outside. I'm going to show you how to make both of those. Here's my basic transfer setup. Transfers is a process of piping royal icing onto acetate or parchment, typically, and then letting them dry completely and then removing them to apply them later to cookies. And the reason you would do that is so that you have more control over the placement of the elements. Or if you want the transfer to hang off a cookie a little bit, you can't pipe royal icing so that it hangs off a cookie. It'll drip off a cookie. So this is a nice way to get it stabilized and set before you put it on a cookie for decoration. Now here's my typical setup. If I am tracing another form, I like to work on acetate because you can't see through parchment paper. So right now I'm working on an acetate, and I'm working on a 3 mil acetate as opposed to 5 mil or 8 mil. Those are all thicker acetates, and I find that the 3 mil acetate's pretty much ideal. It's a little bit flimsier than the others, but that means it's easier to bend and therefore pop off the transfers without moving them, because when royal icing dries, it dries quite firm and brittle and is quite likely to break. In this case, I'm doing ovals. Because I can't pipe an oval very symmetrically freehand, I first printed out the shape that I wanted on my computer. I just repeated it a number of different times using my photo editing software and created exactly the size and shape I wanted for my particular project. For rounds, I'm not that picky. I actually just draw 2 guide marks to determine the diameter of the round I want. So here they're about 1/2 inch apart, so I'll get 1/2 inch circles if I pipe within them. Here they're about 1/4 inch apart. That saves me a little bit of time on the computer. Rounds, I don't ever really trace a template because the icing will tend to go round if it's at the right consistency. So get your setup ready first. I always like to tape the paper and the acetate together with a little painter's tape and have it on something that I can then move out of the way when I'm done and move in another set of transfers to do. You don't want to move the transfers while they're still wet on the acetate because you can misshape them. So I have them all stuck onto a cardboard here. So let me start with the simple gold or caramel colored beads. And my consistency for transfer work is generally whatever consistency I would need to pipe on a regular cookie. Since I'm doing rounds and I want them to flow into a nice round shape, I'm working with something that's very close to my top coating consistency, maybe a little bit thicker because I want these to be very small rounds. I don't want them to spread too much once they hit the acetate. So it's falling slowly off the spoon. And that's a mixture, because I am going to spray these gold. I've tried to get it close to a gold color. It's a mixture of brown and a little bit of gold and yellow. So I've got my icing the right consistency, and my consistency adjustments, a link to them will be in the video description. I've loaded my parchment cone, which I like to work with. And now let's start with the dots because they're the easiest. I'm just going to pipe a dot simply between those guide marks. So I'm adding a few to this row. And I like to do a lot of like ones at the same time so I get in the rhythm. And you can just more or less pipe them pretty uniformly that way. If I stop and start, sometimes I come back and they're a different size. So just by controlling the amount of pressure, I can create a very different size dot. So I'm going to work on these 1/2 inch dots here. Just push a little bit, space them a little bit further apart and push a little bit longer. And I'm stopping just a little bit short of the guide marks because they'll spread a little bit more into place. If your icing's too thick, it might leave a little peak. I think I have it at just the right consistency for what I'm doing. Well, there's a little peak there. If you see that's the case, you can always tap it down with your trussing needle. So that's how you do basic round transfers of one color. And the oval, same process, just I'm barely applying any pressure here because I don't have a long area to fill. I'm more or less just stretching out what I've already piped in there. And if I really want to be exact about it, I can tease it into the exact shape using the end of my trussing needle. These I would typically dry. These are very small transfers, so drying time before you can lift will vary. The smaller the transfer, the sooner you can lift them. Small ones like this I can almost lift within a few hours, but larger ones like these might have to dry overnight, maybe even longer depending on the relative humidity in your room. Now, the other thing to be aware of is to just take some care in how close you pipe them. These two merged together. I piped them a little too close. But once you pipe a few, you'll get a sense of how much they spread on the acetate, and you can gauge your pressure accordingly. I'm going to just flip this around and show you how I did the turquoise ones because they're a little bit more advanced. They involve two colors and a little bit of gilding while the transfers are wet. So I'm starting with kind of a turquoise color naturally. This turquoise naturally comes in various shades and colors. Some are more green than blue. This is basically 1 to 2 parts of sky blue to 2 to 3 parts or more of leaf green to get this shade. The blue tends to color more intensely than the green, so I end up using more green to get it more turquoise looking. So my first step is to actually, we'll do a 1/2 inch size bead. This process is the same regardless of whether you do a small bead or one of those little ovals. So I start by piping my green base, and you know how turquoise looks kind of variegated and has little veins? Well, I'm going to add a little bit of that tan caramel color that I used before. A couple little blobs. It doesn't really matter how it goes down. I'm going to take my trussing needle and just kind of swirl it around a little bit to create a marbled effect. We'll do a few of those. They'll all be a little bit different, but so they would be in real life, which is what's kind of nice. And if you wanted more delicate blobs of tan, you just simply wouldn't open up the tip of your cone so much or press as hard. I have it kind of wide open here. The key thing when you marble it is just to kind of make sure you're marbling in such a way that it maintains its round shape. And let me just do a slightly smaller one, and then I'll come back and show you how I get the gilding on. You have to be a little more delicate with the trussing needle in these tiny spaces, because otherwise it'll overflow very quickly. I'm going to only put one little dot down. I think that's all I need. So we've got something that looks sort of like turquoise, and it'll even look more so by the time I add some gold. And here I've got a gold luster dust. It's quite shiny. And you could apply it, sponge it on when these are completely dry, or you can apply it dry. And I kind of like to apply it dry in powdered form because it just looks a little more shiny that way, a little more vibrant slightly. You can take it on a dry brush, just to dab it into the powder, and then kind of flick the brush on here. I've got a little bit on the end of my, trussing needle. I'm just going to tap it off. I got a lot on that one. I'm going to try to get a little less on that one. But they'll all be a little different, and that's what, again, makes these kind of look more lifelike. So that finishes up the turquoise. You can also, as I said, spray the transfers. And I've got some of these are wet. I don't want to spray the ones that are wet. So what I'm going to do is move my little backboard up, and I'm going to show you how I would spray these little gold ovals on the end. I like to spray when the transfers are dry because this comes out with some impact and it can mess up the shape of the transfer if you spray too hard. So when they're completely dry, just give it a light spray. I'm spraying gold on these caramel ones so they look really shiny. Let that dry. When they're dry, and that will take a few minutes for that luster spray to dry, then we can lift them off. You could take them, and depending on how dry they are, just pop them off. These have been drying for a while, these ones on the end, and they pop right off. But ones that are bigger and more delicate, I don't like to do that because there's more risk of breaking them. So I always take a very thin bladed, this is a very sharp paring knife. Thicker blades can sometimes disrupt the transfers too, and just loosen them and slightly remove them. So it's a pretty easy process provided they're completely dry. So that concludes part 1 of easy transfers, rounds and ovals with various finishes. And on to part 2. Stay tuned. Live sweetly.